Hello, I'm James Cridland, the radio futurologist, and every week or so I write a newsletter about the future of radio, and this is the podcast version where I read it out just for you in case you're too lazy to read it for yourself. And rather bizarrely, this stumbling intro to my podcast was broadcast on Radio 4 Extra last week, which was slightly embarrassing. Yes, I was part of Radio 4 Extra's podcast Radio Hour, which aired at the beginning of June, not quite last week, a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, and they started by playing a little bit of this podcast from a few months ago, which is slightly embarrassing because this is definitely not something that I wanted broadcast on the BBC. But still, there we are. And talking about that, I was at the podcast show 2022 in London at the end of May. A very impressive, super busy event. Delighted to have taken part in that. And delighted too to see that debut event being so well attended, more than 2,600 attendees per day, which was really good. Quite a thing in Islington in London. Now, the BBC announced a number of cuts to its services, which I learnt about at the podcast show, coincidentally just after recording Radio 4 Extra's podcast Radio Hour. And looking at the changes, I have to tell you, they do mostly seem pragmatic and sensible. Firstly, they're going to turn off AM, and that kind of makes sense. BBC Radio 5 Live to cease its AM transmission, something that doesn't even get mentioned in the BBC's own press release. Radio 4 will also come off longwave. Now, back in 2014, 54% of 5 Live's weekly reach was already on DAB. And the government's own review, published last October, recommends that broadcasters develop a plan to retire AM services, saying that less than 3% of radio listening happens on the platform. And it publishes a quite scary-looking graph showing AM's decline, which basically says that by 2027, no one will be listening. It's very expensive to broadcast on AM as well, particularly the electricity costs, so it's no surprise that the BBC plans quite sensibly, I think, to turn them off. Also, they're getting rid of the archive stations as well. BBC Radio 4 Extra and BBC 4 Television will both cease to be broadcast. Now, I happen to think that archive channels like that are better suited for on-demand anyway. The brands might be retained for curated playlists within BBC Sounds and BBC iPlayer. I would suspect that they probably will be, because, you always need a little bit of curation somewhere. But I don't think we're going to see those being broadcast live. Now, it is unlikely that that will mean a reduction in the availability of that archive programming. It just won't be available in a linear broadcast anymore. I'm not sure that archive programming by its very nature benefits from live linear broadcasting, and even if there are relatively few savings to be made in terms of transmission costs, it makes sense to make the archive more focused on on-demand, and that will need Ofcom permission because iPlayer has a maximum number of archive series that it's allowed to have available, and presumably BBC Sounds does as well, but you'd assume that they'd be comfortable with that. The BBC has also announced that its news channels on TV are to merge. Now, they run two TV channels, BBC News, which is a domestic 24-hour news channel, and BBC World News, the international news channel, which is funded by cable carriage fees and advertising. Now, the plan is to merge the two and call it BBC News. Who'd have thought? Now, from an expat point of view, I have to say, that makes sense. Nobody watches CNN International for their stories about Namibia or Sierra Leone. People watch CNN International for their US news and their US views on international stories too. So US stories are the majority of the output on CNN International, and quite rightly. But BBC World News doesn't seem to answer any particular audience need to me. I think it's quite a dull channel. It's full of stories about countries I've barely visited and information I've no need to know. It covers precious little about the UK. And that is odd. And If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you'll know that I found BBC World News' coverage of the crisis around the Brexit parliamentary votes was significantly lacking. There's precious little coverage, too, of Partygate on BBC World News and the state of the British economy on that channel either. And it strikes me as quite irritating that in order to learn about Britain, I have to watch Sky News UK rather than the BBC. BBC World News doesn't reflect BBC Charter's public purpose number 5 either, which is to reflect the United Kingdom, its culture and values to the world. Its international services should put the United Kingdom in a world context, aiding understanding of the United Kingdom as a whole, including its nations and regions where appropriate. Now, I know the BBC World News is a BBC Studios channel. It doesn't come under the Charter, but the point of the Charter is to at least help the BBC understand what it is doing and what it should be doing, and it very clearly is not doing that. And I also think that the BBC World News significantly underperforms in the BBC's Charter purpose because it insists on making itself available on pay TV only. So I can't actually legally watch the channel unless I pay money to Fetch or Foxtel here in Australia. Now I can watch GB News, brilliant, Sky News UK, great, Talk TV, TRT World, RT, CBS News, plenty of other channels for free, and I wonder whether the increased influence in making BBC News Channel free on all platforms would be a benefit to the UK. Of course, it'll never happen, but there we are. But what's most impressive, I think, is that all of these cuts aren't begrudging by the BBC to squeeze a £285 million shortfall. These cuts are actually going to contribute to savings of more than £500 million, and they will help refocus the corporation on platforms that are growing rather than platforms which are shrinking. And I know it's another unsettling and uncertain set of changes for BBC staff who have rather more of these changes than others, but I do think those changes are good news for the BBC and for its consumers. In other news, Fred Jacobs released the TechSurvey 2022. It's worthwhile viewing that through the lens of radio superfans because it's made up of 31,000 survey results recruited from radio station websites and listener clubs. So it skews quite old, but don't think that it's irrelevant because it certainly isn't. Even with superfans, you can see that the way people listen to the radio is changing and changing very quickly. Radio-Canada has made their award-winning bespoke font available to everybody, which is an interesting move. Now, I said I doubt we'll see Reith or ABC Sans doing similar. Reith is the BBC's font. Actually, it is available for download. You can only really use it under agreement, but anybody can actually download it. So you kind of think that they're probably allowing anybody to play around with that as well. It's a lovely font too, or a lovely set of fonts, I should say, because they've got Reith Sans and Reith Serif. Oh dear, we're diving down the font rabbit hole. Let's get out of that. Back in 2015, Global Radio told its journalists not to cover a story about HSBC helping wealthy clients whisk money offshore. Well, this month it emerges that it told its journalists not to mention any allegations around Tim Westwood, according to The Guardian. The story was a Guardian exclusive. Westwood, who is suspended, denies all of the allegations, which I haven't even mentioned here on this podcast, because, you know, he's denying all of them. The most surprising fact, I think, from the stories is that Tim Westwood is 65. Tim Westwood, 65. How old do you feel now? The new 107.9 in Sacramento broadcasts Star Wars music non-stop on May the 4th, and plenty more stunts since then. In fact, let's click that link and find out whether or not they've actually announced what the radio station is going to be. Yes, they have. KISS 107.9 for the 90s and 2000s. How thrillingly exciting. Anyway, yes, they've been doing lots of these stunts, and all of that is rather lovely. To be fair, I'm not a particular fan of stunts. And I didn't really care what they were going to end up broadcasting on the frequency, 90s and 2000s tunes. But I guess it means that at least I'm writing about them, so well done them, I suppose. There's a big shouting match in Radio World about shortwave, including rather a bit about DRM. Nobody yet has actually clarified whether anyone owns any shortwave receivers anymore, and I don't think anyone in real life bothers with shortwave, I said. Of course, I got an email. I'm going to cough. Hang on. Professional podcast this. Of course, I got an email from somebody who was saying, oh, yes, I listen to shortwave and so do all my friends. But no, I don't think that anybody else really bothers with it. Do you bother with shortwave? Do you know lots of people who do? I'd love to know, james@cred.land. And RAJAR came out in the UK. I link to a Lazy Buggles headline about it. Also some views from Matt Deegan and graphs and more analysis from Adam Bowie as well, which are well worth a read. You'll find all of that linked from this podcast. And thank you to Richard Hilton, James Masterton and Brunn Audio Consulting for your ongoing support of this podcast. I'm very grateful to you. If you'd like to support my work in any way, you can buy me a coffee. Become a member to give regularly or just give a one-off coffee or 5. You can do that at buymeacoffee.com/JamesCridland. And my professional website has more detail about who I am and what I do and whether I can help you further. Now, this is where I pretend that I didn't forget to record this and say, I'll be at Canadian Music Week next week. Yes, might have already been there. Anyway, that's all for now, and I will be back momentarily with another episode of this podcast. So until then, keep listening.